Hello everybody and welcome to our webinar series on software monetization. My name is Holger Schulze. I am Director of Marketing here at SafeNet and I'll be your moderator today. In today's webcast, How to Get Software Licensing Right the First Time, we will discuss the importance of integrating your licensing approach with your business processes even before you worry about integrating licensing technology into your software products. Our presenter today is David DiMillo, Principal Consultant at SafeNet. Dave is an industry veteran with many years of experience in software licensing, and in his capacity as Principal Consultant, Dave helps businesses with the ins and outs of software licensing and entitlement management to build successful licensing strategies. But before we get started, I'd like to remind you that you can submit questions at any time during the live webcast. Simply click the Ask a Question button on your screen to enter a question, and we'll collect all questions during the webcast and then have a brief Q&A section at the end of the webcast. Also, if you would like to share this webcast with your friends and colleagues, you can click the Share This button on your screen and share a link using LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and many other social media platforms. Now, without further ado, let's get started and open the line for David DiMillo to tell us about how to approach software licensing the right way. Dave, take it away.
Thanks, Holger. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name's Dave DiMillo. I work for SafeNet in our professional services organization, and I head up our consulting team. Just a couple bits of information about my background. So I came from the industry working for a few major software vendors with owning their licensing system. So I've seen the ins and outs really from the operational side and kind of understand pretty well what businesses go through to evaluate a licensing landscape, to put together a licensing strategy and implement technology and processes and really make that entire system work for the business and own the business case. So I bring those types of experiences to SafeNet in a consulting role, and we'll talk more about that later. And the topic today is how to get licensing right the first time. And in my work in the past, I've worked with lots of director level, C-level executives and so forth, and I hear a lot of common themes where people are coming to us saying, we need more control over customer usage, but we're not really sure where to begin. We know we want to approach a licensing project. We know we've got information in lots of buckets, and we're not really sure who's going to own this overall project. Or we've started down this path and it just tends to be a little bit more broad than we thought it to be. So in general, when I start working with these teams, more often than not, I find that the teams tend to be, a little unorganized, not really sure where to start, which is perfectly normal. So, I got to thinking, why is that? Well, our clients, SafeNet's customers and prospects, they come to us most of the time thinking they have a technical problem. Because as I mentioned before, they say, I want to protect my revenue stream. I want to put some controls in my software and user experience so that I can better govern my business. And they start thinking along the terms of that technical integration, right? And that's how they generally find SafeNet, right? Because we're a software vendor, we're pretty easy to find, and that's how we generally get introduced. But as we start working with these teams, what we find out and what these teams find out about themselves is they usually have more of a process problem than they do a technical problem. And that's largely because a technical problem oftentimes is pretty easy to solve, and you end up, popping your head up and realizing that you've got more of an integration problem, business integration. And just focusing on technology alone puts these teams in a bad spot. Because when you've got technology, and particularly around license management where orders are flowing through your systems, you're you're selling goods, you're executing sales orders and so forth, and you have information moving through the system, you have moving parts. And when you have moving parts, you have process. And really, again, the focus on just the technology tends to ignore the process pieces of this equation, and I've seen more than my fair share of implementations gone bad as teams, generally focus on technology. So we're going to take a look at that, and again, the topic here is how to get licensing right the first time, and so my first suggestion is around process, and it's probably going to be a occurring theme here as we move forward. So in this chart, what I've done here is listed out a number of things that any project leader who's heading up a licensing project will have to deal with at some point in their life cycle. Certainly at varying levels, but at the top you've got, the strategy as far as what you folks want to do. Then you move into developing a model, and then requirements and use cases, and all the way down through engineering, development, product launch, and then system stability and maintenance and optimization as you move ahead. Okay, all that stuff makes sense. But what happens is, if you look at this next chart here, and look at the sections that I've highlighted in gray, there seems to be this gravity in this particular business towards the technology. So more often than not, when I start working with teams that are going down this path, particularly for the first time, they will get a hold of, let's say, one of the SafeNet software development kits, and they get their engineering teams involved, and they start looking at the bits and bytes, and then they say, okay, yeah, we can build this. This isn't really that hard. We'll put together an engineering plan and figure out on the back office sort of what we do. And again, that's very common, but if you look at it in the big picture, the things that come before it are really important, and that is, really the focus of my topic here today. And in getting licensing right the first time is focusing on the business integration, because chances are you're going to have more business process and business integration challenges. Maybe they're not very hard, but you're going to have more of them than you will technical challenges. I'm willing to make that bet. So as I've presented this chart in the past, I usually get a lot of heads nodding, but I started thinking about why that gravity exists. Why do these teams automatically go there, and why do they tend to ignore really good planning and vision development around licensing? It seems to, again, licensing just has this technical gravity of its own. So what are they missing? Okay, why is that gravity there? And what I came up with was really the licensing vision, right? Is being able to visualize in your head how the whole system is going to work, right? How do all the pieces fit together, right? Usually, again, the teams that I work with, they know that they have to do something, right? But they're not really sure exactly the pieces that maybe they need to do, what pieces can they outsource, which things do they need to emphasize, which things are from an industry standard perspective, should they not focus on or aren't really all that important. And so they tend to lack the big picture vision. And without that vision, it's really hard to execute when you don't have the vision, because you really don't know what you're going to build. So you end up just, again, gravitating towards some technology, and ultimately you may end up building the wrong thing. So let's take a look at that for a second. As far as guiding a team in how to prepare and how to go down this path the right way for the first time, I tend to focus on three specific elements, right? There's sales models, operations, and enforcement. Okay, and I would recommend any software vendor, any team that's approaching licensing, to go about it in this way. put together a licensing planning workshop internally with all the right stakeholders, since licensing is a team sport. Not only is it a team sport, it's probably one of the biggest team sports you have internally, because if you think about it in terms of a corporate Venn diagram, right, between all the different organizations, your licensing and execution of your licensing is probably right in the middle of it, right, because it does involve your sales teams. It involves finance. It involves order admin, IT, development, tech support, product management, right, operations, the list goes on. So these cross-functional teams and planning workshops to sort of understand that big picture is really key. And the way I do it, and we'll talk a little bit more about SafeNet planning workshops later on, but what I would encourage anybody to do is, again, start at the top, start with your sales models. Forget the technology and ask yourselves, how are we selling today? How do we need to sell in the future? Right? And if we had more control, or ask your sales teams in particular, if you had more control over the software behavior, regardless of what that control is, how would you like to be selling? Would you like to, again, sell per unit time? Would you like to, sell your technology in little tiny bites? Would you want your customers to do site licensing and then charge them after the fact? How do you think you can make the most money? How can you monetize your software the best way? Okay? And then once you understand a little bit more about how you are selling and how you want to sell, spend plenty of time looking at your operations. Generally, I find with most companies, particularly the big ones, there's usually maybe one or two people that really understand what happens when your sales teams place an order, when it goes to your system, all the way from quoting through order entry, through getting the part numbers built into the bill of materials, flowing down into the ERP, into CRM, and how the customers get notified, and RevRec, and so forth. Really take time to understand that, and focus on what actually happens, what you want to have happen as far as your customer experience. How do you want them to get notified of those orders, and take real close inventory of your different ordering and fulfillment use cases, right? This is usually a pretty significant problem for teams going down this path the first time if they don't know any better, right? Generally, in the ordering and operational domain, there's probably, on average, I'd say there's probably 7 or 8, maybe less than 10, core ordering use cases that you really need to look at and you really need to understand them. Okay, from initial purchase to add-on purchases, you have to understand how renewal maintenance factors in, and so forth. And then once you have a pretty good idea of how all that stuff works, then start thinking about your license enforcement and putting in controls, and ask yourself how you feel about the philosophy of license enforcement and how deep rooted you really want it and how strict you want your licensing to be. I think that's an important point as well. And I've got one question on here that talks about security versus software piracy, which are two very different things. And I think it's important to ask yourself and perhaps ask your head of sales how he or she feels about compliance versus piracy, because that's going to play a key role in your license enforcement implementation. So, for example, if your head of sales, if your sales teams feel strongly that you need to prevent piracy at all costs in all regions of the world, your implementation is going to look a lot different than if your corporate philosophy is one in which you just want to put some tools in place to keep your honest customers doing the honest thing, and make it inconvenient for them to inadvertently get themselves out of compliance. Two very different philosophies, two very different implementations, right? So those types of questions matter. Okay, and sort of in general, flush these types of discussions out in the planning workshop. I think they're great. I've done plenty of them myself. Generally, the teams find out a lot about how they do business internally just day to day by getting together and working through these things as a team over a couple days. Okay, Holger, I don't want to press the wrong button here. Here we go. So what I find is that once these workshops tend to take place and you get a pretty good idea of how you want to sell and what you want that customer experience to be and how, you know, orders will flow through the system and your customers will receive goods, you know, we can go ahead and build that vision out and build it out in PowerPoint or whatever tool is available, build it out in a very illustrative way to give others a feel for how things are going to work under certain conditions, paint the picture, and from you know, these basic sets of architectural diagrams, you know, you can take that next step towards design. And this is, you know, it's simple, it makes sense, it's fundamental, but it's often overlooked. Probably more often than not, this step is overlooked in building out that vision over those core, you know, 8, 10, 15 core use cases. So this next chart here is actually a chart that one of our customers, Cisco, presented at a SafeNet function. So this is a chart that they built. It's not my chart. And the point of this chart is if you just look at a couple of these silos on here, the licensing piece is just one of these tiny little silos, right? So they have exactly the right perspective. And that right perspective is that all these things need to happen in order for their licensing to work. They're focused on the process and all the different things that need to happen around the technology to make it all work. Because in their minds, if all those cylinders aren't working together, their licensing is broken. So they've got exactly the right approach. This is why their licensing works for them. And not just focused on that technology piece. They didn't gravitate towards that cylinder in the lower left that says CLM in it. I think it's a great example of one company has the right approach. They're looking at licensing holistically as an entire ecosystem, right? And they did a nice job here. So again, we'll talk about some SafeNet workshops in a little bit, but as the outcomes to those workshops that I've done personally, I brought forward a couple quotes that I found interesting during my work. And I was working with a company in the U.S. here, and we started down this path the first day, and we're talking about, you know, sales models and process. And, you know, some of these guys were getting antsy, and they didn't really understand fully where things were going. And so what he said to me after is that, you know, the first day when you were focusing on all our processes, I was really wondering, you know, where you were heading and how everything was going to come together for us. But then he finally realized that those are exactly the conversations they needed to have, right? They didn't have them. They had no idea how things were going to work. The process was a thing that flushed out really what their problems were and paved the way for us to put together a vision for them to move ahead. And then the second quote on this page is kind of a interesting story. I was working with a customer in EMEA, and the second day of our workshop, the CIO comes in. He didn't have the benefit of the first couple days, and at that point we were talking about technology, and you know, he came down very forcibly and said, you know, if we only focus on technology, we will fail. So he had exactly the right point, and it's what we've been preaching the whole time. So it's, again, I think he was right on the mark. Okay, so let's keep going ahead here. Also, when I've worked with other companies, getting those teams together, having those process and technology and requirements discussions, and you know, really starting at the top. We worked with one company in the UK, and out of our planning workshop, they identified 4 different ways that they could sell software, that their sales teams really wanted to sell software. And again, we were able to surface those and put together a plan for them to start bringing those models to market. It only happened because, again, we forced the conversation. We had the sales teams in on the planning workshops. We started at the top with the sales models, And when we walked out a few days later, we had the vision, and that those new sales models were part of that. There's some other information on this chart here that you can read through yourself. So let's take a look at how one software company dealt with sort of the problem of business process and evolving and streamline their processes. So the original state was one in which this company, and this is, I should say, this is a real company with real numbers and real dollars here. Right, so this company was around 120 different software products and about $500 million in annual software revenues, right? So pretty good sized company. They had 3 licensing technologies acquired through their process of acquisitions. And when you have 3 different licensing technologies, you tend to have 3 different unique customer experiences, which is really not good, because what happens is this particular company was selling selling bundles that included products from those 3 different product families. So the result is that the customer buys one thing, buys the bundle, and then is sent in 3 different directions to fulfill the license keys from that one thing that they bought. Not the best user experience. So the other thing I want to point out here is that the company was generating those license keys manually. Okay, so half of the license keys they generated were done manually. The company had sold a lot of product over time, so this was high volume, high cost type of software. So they ended up with 13 people that were doing nothing but generating keys full time. And if your processes aren't streamlined, if they're not automated, you can easily find yourself getting into this situation where, again, 13 people doing nothing but generate license keys for customers. So the result here is that, those 13 people were costing this company over $1.3 million a year just in headcount to generate keys, which is, 80% of the total cost of ownership of their licensing project. So that's the original state. So we worked with them to get efficient, right? Streamline the processes, move to an automated system, moved all the license key generations to a single scalable platform, right? And I'm going to emphasize the word scalable because we're going to see what that did a few years later, with a customer self-service portal. And then what that does is it consolidated those user experiences into one single experience. Okay, so regardless of which product the customer bought, they were always going to the same place to generate those keys. Customer self-service, they were put the onus on the customers to kind of go in and help themselves. And within a year or so, they were saving over $500,000 a year simply in headcount, right? By streamlining processes, having a vision of putting the whole thing together in a way that's much more automated, much more customer friendly, and much less expensive, actually. Okay, so all that's fine and good, but here's where the scalability paid off. Okay, because they developed a scalable corporate standard. A couple years later, they ended up with 4 more incremental acquisitions. And in those acquisitions, or each of those acquisitions had another license manager, right? And not only did they have another license manager, but across the 4 companies, they had an additional 14 headcount that were doing nothing but generating license keys. So the question was, from an IT perspective, do I need to maintain 4 more license generators? And from a process and license key generation perspective, do we need to really add 14 more people? Well, the answer is no, right? Because you had a scalable, streamlined corporate standard for license key generation. This company moved all the license key generation to that corporate standard, to their new streamlined process, and didn't need to add any of those 14 people. So sort of netting this out, had this company done nothing, again, and not sort of grab the whole of step back and defined a new vision for how they really wanted to go to market and do business, they could have ended up with 7 licensing technologies with upwards of 27 people generating keys, a real mess. You know, that would have been over $3.1 million a year just in headcount, but the actual run rate was just over $1 million, with simply 8 people supporting that as opposed to 27. Happy story. So the net of that entire use case here is that, you know, these streamlined processes allow the company to reduce headcount by 38% in the first year, and quite a bit more, including the acquisitions. And more importantly than that, really, they deliver a single customer experience, and that's really huge. So again, no matter what product this company sold, the customer had exactly the same experience in license key generation. Okay, and this would not have gotten done had they not taken the time to step back, right, look at what they're doing, develop a new vision for how they wanted to execute, and bring that vision to reality. Now, as far as SafeNet is concerned, we offer some professional services that are specifically designed for this purpose. So if you're interested in understanding a little bit more about software licensing best practices, or you'd like to have us come in and work with you to take stock of your landscape, your licensing needs, your customer experience that you'd like, and work with you to put together a vision, we can deliver those types of services, as well as implementation and all the way through to execution. And we can talk a little bit more about that in a second. Okay, so just to sum up my slides, I do see a few questions here, and we're going to get to those in a second. You know, for any business, pricing models, business models are evolving. Take the time to align your license enforcement with those. You know, another one of the biggest mistakes I see teams make is they'll put together a license enforcement, and then over time they don't revisit it, and license enforcement ends up being the tail that wags the dog, as we say, right? Because they don't go back and try to, you know, get in the heads of their sales and pricing teams to try to understand how they really want to sell, right, and align those enforcement models to that. As we mentioned before, pay attention to that gravitational pull towards technology, particularly if you've never done this before. It's really about process, and how you want to deliver a clean customer experience. Okay, next slide. Finally, we've got some contact information here. If you want to contact me directly, you can send an email to professionalservices@SafeNet. You can find us on the web, and we've got a blog and all kinds of social networking contact information on here. Now, we will be posting this webinar on the web. Is that right, Holger? As soon as we're done?
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
Yes, so that will be available online for you to browse and view at your leisure. Okay, so Holger, why don't we stop at this point and take a look at the questions?
Yes, excellent. Thank you, Dave. So everybody, if you would like to submit a question, just click on the Ask a Question button on your screen. Let's give this a few seconds and wait for a couple of questions to come in. All right, let's get started. So the first question is, what is the #1 piece of advice you would give to a company who's getting started with software licensing?
The #1 piece of advice I would give is assign an owner to it. Make it somebody's job to get, not only to get your project off the ground and running and implemented, but who would own it post launch. as I mentioned before, licensing can be in the middle of this huge Venn diagram, and a lot of people, in fact, every organization in your company, or most of them anyway, have some sort of stake in it, but nobody really wants to own it. Okay, so my advice is to find an owner and make that owner responsible for the overall success of the project. Now, speaking of owners, a lot of times I get asked which organization I feel has had the most success in owning the licensing systems. So, and my response is usually one in which I say, because licensing doesn't fit cleanly into any organization, any one organization, what I usually recommend is for the owner to have a good, solid customer background, right? If product management or customer support, those two organizations seem to really understand what's happening in the field, understand what's happening to their customers, and make sure that their customers are well taken care of. And I think that's really what the license enforcement, a significant piece of it, is about. So again, probably somebody in product management who has a pretty good idea of how their customers work, how their customers deploy software, and can keep an eye on that customer experience.
All right, very good.
Okay.
The next question we have here is, let me see, what type of licensing scenario is generally the most challenging?
What type is generally the most challenging? I've worked with systems where enforcing version control with respect to maintenance agreement status. It's not something that's rocket science. It's not particularly hard. It's just one of these things that's detail oriented, and my advice to anybody trying to do that is really try to understand all the use cases around how your customers purchase your renewal maintenance, the relationship between your renewal maintenance part numbers and your initial license part numbers, if there is a relationship in your system. And again, all the purchasing use cases around renewing and quantities and so forth. As I said, it's not rocket science, but it's something that requires an additional level of discipline, I would say, in planning.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. The next question coming in is, what organization within the software vendor do you think is best equipped to be the overall owner for licensing?
Yeah, as I just mentioned before, so I would recommend somebody in product management or customer support, somebody that's customer facing, so they can keep close hands on your customers. So actually in the questions here, Holger, I see a question around they're using USBs and HASP both for timed and untimed, and they want to convert this to self-service customer fulfillment. So if the person who asked this question wants to contact me, we can certainly talk about that. There is customer self-service for software licensing, whether it's HASP or other SafeNet technologies, and we can certainly talk you through that and sort of point you in the right direction. So absolutely.
All right. So we're getting against our time window. Dave, do you want to take another question, or?
Sure. I can see from the pull down here.
Yep.
Okay, so another question here is around, the question is, quote, we resell-acquire licenses. How do companies handle automated licensing in these cases? That's a really good question, by the way. In fact, I was just with a customer last week that had exactly the situation. They were baking SafeNet license enforcement into their own products, but one product they OEM'd that had its own licensing, and they needed to be able to still deliver that. So this is more of a back office challenge and making sure you have a clean customer experience, and to do a SafeNet plug, the SafeNet back office tool can accommodate a third-party license generator, or even then pass along fulfillment of third-party licenses that have been pre-generated. So I think the trick here is to do it in a way so that you have the same customer experience, whether your customer is buying a product that you built yourself or a product that you're OEMing. And again, anybody who's asking these questions, if we don't get your questions, feel free to contact me directly at professional services at safenet-inc.com, and we can, I'm more than happy to interface directly with you and look at all these in more detail.
Excellent. All right, thank you, Dave. And thank you all for submitting your questions. And looks like we have more questions than time left to answer them. So as Dave said, if you want to send us your questions to professional services at safenet-inc.com, we'll follow up with you. Thank you again for taking the time to join us today. And also many thanks to Dave DiMillo for his insights into licensing strategy and telling us about the importance of integrating a company's licensing approach with the business processes first, before worrying about integrating technology into products. And please feel free to join our other on-demand webcasts that we have on Bright Talk, which is the same webcast channel that you're on right now. And also, please join our upcoming webcasts on software monetization. And I look forward to seeing you at our upcoming webcast. Thank you for your time.